The first ice block weighed more than Thomas expected. He stood at the edge of the frozen lake, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air, and wrapped both hands around the block he had cut. It was clear as glass in the center, milky white at the edges where frost had crept in. He lifted it carefully, feeling the cold burn through his leather gloves, and carried it up the slope toward his cabin. His shepherd dog, Ash, followed behind, paws crunching in the snow, tail low and uncertain. The gray and brown mixed breed had been his grandfather's dog originally, passed down when the old man died 2 years ago, and Ash seemed to sense when Thomas was attempting something unprecedented. Thomas had carved 20 blocks already that morning. He would need 200 more, perhaps 300. He didn't know exactly. He only knew that winter was coming harder this year than any he could remember in his 17 years, and the cabin his grandfather had built wouldn't hold the heat well enough to keep him alive through it. So he would build another wall, a wall of ice around the wooden one. The neighbors, when they saw him carrying the first blocks up from the lake, stopped their work to watch. Old Henrik called out from his porch, his voice carrying across the snow. "What are you building, boy? An ice house?" Thomas didn't answer. He set the block down 3 feet from the cabin's north wall and went back for another. Ash stayed near the cabin, watching his human with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to question every decision. By the second trip, Henrik had walked over, his boots squeaking in the snow. "You planning to freeze yourself to death faster?" he asked, his weathered face creased with skepticism. "Building walls of ice around a cabin in winter? That's the maddest thing I've seen, and I've seen plenty of madness in these mountains." Thomas positioned the second block beside the first, checking the alignment with care. "Ice insulates," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. Henrik laughed, a sharp bark that sent Ash's ears back flat against his skull. "Ice melts, boy. You'll flood yourself out before Christmas. Mark my words. You'll be begging for shelter at my place when this foolishness collapses." Then Henrik walked back to his own property, shaking his head and muttering about young fools who thought they knew better than their elders. But Thomas had done his research. He had spent the previous winter reading his grandfather's journals, the ones kept in the locked chest under the bed. His grandfather, Samuel, had been a surveyor and cartographer, had traveled far north into territories where winter lasted 9 months, and the indigenous people built structures from snow and ice that stayed warmer inside than wooden houses. The journals described the principle carefully in his grandfather's precise handwriting. Ice, when thick enough, trapped air. Air, when trapped and still, held warmth. A double wall with a gap between created a barrier that wind couldn't penetrate and heat couldn't escape through as easily. The journals included sketches, measurements, observations from 3 different northern expeditions. Samuel had been fascinated by the ingenuity of people who survived in places that would kill unprepared men in hours. He had documented everything, filled 6 journals with notes and drawings, and Thomas had read them all twice. Thomas had sketched the design dozens of times throughout the autumn. He knew it would work. The physics made sense. The observations from his grandfather's journals were consistent. He simply had to build it before the deep cold arrived, before the lake became too dangerous to cut ice from, before his firewood supply became critical. The lake ice was perfect that year. It had frozen early in late October, and by mid-November it was nearly 2 feet thick, clear and solid. Thomas used his grandfather's old saw, the 2-man crosscut saw he had to operate alone, wedging one end against a log and pulling with both arms on the other. Each block took 20 minutes to cut, 20 minutes of muscle-straining effort that left his arms trembling and his back aching. He worked from dawn until his hands went numb, then warmed them by the fire and went back out. Ash stayed with him every day, watching as the blocks piled up near the cabin, occasionally wandering to investigate interesting scents, but always returning to check on Thomas. By the end of the first week, he had enough ice to complete the north wall. He stacked the blocks carefully, offsetting them like bricks, packing snow into the gaps to seal them. The wall rose to 6 feet, level with the cabin's roof edge. He left a 3-foot gap between the ice and the wood, just as his grandfather's journal had specified. The gap had to be wide enough to prevent the ice from touching the cabin directly, but narrow enough to trap the air effectively and create the thermal barrier he needed. When he finished the north wall, Thomas stepped back to examine it. The ice gleamed in the afternoon light, blue-white and solid. He could see through it in places, distorted images of the cabin's log walls visible through the translucent barrier. Ash sniffed at the base of the wall, then looked up at Thomas as if asking whether this strange construction made sense. Thomas knelt down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "It'll work," he said softly. "Trust me, boy. It'll work." Ash's tail wagged once, uncertain but trusting, and Thomas felt a surge of affection for the animal. At least someone believed in him, even if that someone was a dog who would have followed him into fire if asked. The neighbors came to watch more often as the work continued. Henrik brought 2 others, Carl and Josef, men who had homesteaded in the valley longer than Thomas had been alive. They stood at the edge of his property and discussed the ice walls like judges at a trial, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. "He's wasting his time," Carl said, arms crossed over his heavy coat. "First warm day, it'll all melt and he'll have nothing but puddles and regret." "Won't be any warm days till March," Joseph replied, his breath frosting in the air. "But what's the point? Ice doesn't keep heat in. It keeps cold in. That's what ice does. That's the whole purpose of ice." The boys touched in the head. Henrik added, "Grief does strange things to young minds. Losing his grandfather affected him more than we realized." Thomas ignored them. He had learned early that arguing with skeptics was pointless. Results spoke louder than words, and he would have results soon enough. He started on the east wall, cutting more blocks, hauling them up the slope one by one, stacking them precisely. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His shoulders ached every morning when he woke. His back protested every time he bent to lift another block. But the wall grew steadily, day by day, block by block. Ash learned to stay out of the way when Thomas was hauling ice, learned to sit patiently during the long hours of construction, learned to bark once, sharply, when it was time to go inside and warm up, because Thomas's hands were shaking too badly to work safely. By the start of December, 3 walls were complete, north, east, and south, all surrounded by shimmering barriers of ice 6 feet high, all with the careful 3-foot gap between ice and wood. Thomas started on the west wall, the last side, the one that faced the prevailing wind. This wall would be the most important. The winter storms in this valley always came from the west, driving snow and cold before them like weapons. He made the west wall thicker, cutting larger blocks, stacking them in a double layer in places, ensuring no gaps existed where wind could penetrate. Henrik came by again, this time with his wife, Martha. She carried a basket covered with cloth. Thomas was in the gap between walls, checking his work, when they arrived. Ash barked once in greeting, tail wagging because Martha had always been kind, slipping the dog scraps when she thought no one was looking. "Thomas," Martha called gently, "we brought you some bread, fresh baked this morning." Thomas emerged from between the walls, his face red from cold and exertion. He accepted the basket gratefully, nodding his thanks. The bread was still warm, the smell making his stomach clench with hunger. He hadn't eaten since dawn, too focused on finishing the west wall before the next storm arrived. Martha looked at the ice walls, at the careful construction, at the exhaustion evident in Thomas's face. "Boy," she said gently, "you need to stop this. You'll work yourself to death before winter even arrives. This obsession isn't healthy." Thomas met her eyes. He saw genuine concern there, maternal worry for a 17-year-old who had been orphaned too young and lived alone with just a dog for company. "I appreciate the concern, Martha," he said quietly, "but I have to finish this. I have to know if it works." Henrik grunted, his expression somewhere between frustration and grudging respect. "You're just like your grandfather," he said. "Samuel was the most stubborn man I ever knew. Once he got an idea in his head, nothing could shake it loose." Martha touched her husband's arm. "His grandfather had sense, though," she said. "Samuel was educated, traveled, knew things. This boy is following his teachings." Henrik shook his head. His grandfather had sense enough not to build ice walls around his cabin. "There's a difference between knowledge and application, Martha. But they left the bread, and Thomas ate it that night by the fire, the dog's head resting on his knee, sharing pieces with Ash, who accepted them with gentle jaws and grateful eyes. The bread was good, still slightly warm, and Thomas felt a moment of gratitude for neighbors who brought food even when they thought he was crazy. The west wall took 8 days to complete. Thomas worked through a snowstorm on the 6th day, his hands so cold he couldn't feel the ice blocks anymore, navigating by memory and determination and stubbornness that would have made his grandfather proud. Ash stayed with him even through the worst of it, a gray shadow in the blowing snow, refusing to abandon his human, even when sense would have dictated retreating to warmth. When Thomas finally set the last block in place, he stood in the center of the gap between cabin and ice, surrounded by walls on all 4 sides, and felt the difference immediately. The wind, which had been howling across the valley all day, was gone. Not diminished, not reduced, gone. The air in the gap was still, almost eerily so. He could hear his own breathing, rapid from exertion. He could hear Ash panting beside him. Nothing else. The wind screamed somewhere above and beyond the ice walls, but in this protected space, silence reigned. Thomas placed his bare hand against the cabin's log wall, cold, but not freezing, not the bitter, penetrating cold that seeped through wood when wind drove it. Then he placed his other hand against the ice wall, colder, much colder, pulling heat from his palm immediately, making his skin ache. But the gap between them, the air in that 3-foot space, felt neutral, calm, protected. Thomas smiled for the first time in weeks. His face felt strange, muscles unused to the expression after so many days of grim determination. He looked down at Ash, and the dog's tail wagged, feeding off his human's sudden joy. "We did it, boy," Thomas said. "We actually did it." Ash barked, a sharp sound of celebration, and jumped up to place his paws on Thomas's chest. Thomas laughed and ruffled the thick fur, feeling the warmth of the dog through his gloves, feeling accomplishment and relief and bone-deep exhaustion all mixed together. The first truly brutal cold arrived on December 8th. Thomas woke to a temperature that had dropped overnight to 20 below zero. The air itself felt solid, resistant, like breathing through cloth. He expected to find frost on the inside of his window, something that had happened regularly in previous winters. But the glass was clear. He placed his hand against it. Cold, yes, but not ice cold, not frozen. Thomas stepped outside into the gap between the walls, wearing just his shirt and pants, no coat. The cold was present but manageable, not comfortable, not warm, but survivable without the wind cutting through fabric and flesh. He walked the perimeter slowly, checking each section of ice wall. No cracks, no melting, no structural failures. The snow he had packed into the gaps had frozen solid, creating perfect seals. The blocks had fused together slightly, ice bonding to ice, making the walls even stronger than when he had first built them. Thomas nodded to himself, satisfaction warming him from the inside. Then he went back into the cabin. Ash followed, shaking snow from his fur, settling by the hearth with a contented sigh. That night, Thomas kept the fire smaller than usual. It was an experiment, a test of his theory. Normally, he would pile the wood high to keep the cabin warm through the night, burning through 4 or 5 logs before dawn. But he wanted to see if the ice walls made the difference his grandfather's journals promised. He built a modest fire, enough to take the edge off the cold, and went to bed with an extra blanket. He woke once in the night, around 2 in the morning by his pocket watch. He expected to be freezing, expected to see his breath fogging in the air, expected to need to rebuild the fire immediately. But the cabin was tolerably warm, not hot, not even what he would call comfortable by summer standards, but warm enough that his breath didn't fog, warm enough that his fingers didn't ache when he moved them under the blanket, warm enough that Ash was sleeping peacefully on the floor rather than pressed against him for warmth. Thomas got up and checked the fire, still burning, but low, reduced to coals and small flames. He added 1 log, just one, and went back to bed. In the morning, he did the calculation. He had used less than half the firewood he normally would. The ice walls were working. The principle his grandfather had documented was sound. The physics were real. Thomas felt a wave of emotion, complex and overwhelming. Pride in his achievement, grief that his grandfather wasn't here to see it, relief that he would survive the winter, vindication that the neighbor's skepticism had been wrong. He sat on the edge of his bed, Ash's head in his lap, and let himself feel it all for a moment before standing and starting his day. Henrik came by 3 days later, stomping snow off his boots in the gap between the walls. He looked around at the ice barriers, at the cabin sitting protected in the center, and shook his head in what might have been wonder, or might have been continued disbelief. Thomas couldn't quite tell. "You actually finished it," Henrik said, his voice neutral, carefully controlled. Thomas was splitting wood near the entrance, building up his supply now that he knew he would use less than anticipated. He set down the axe and nodded. "Yes, sir. Finished it last week." Henrik walked the perimeter, his experienced eyes examining the construction. He had built 3 cabins in his lifetime, raised 2 barns, knew carpentry and masonry and stonework. His examination was thorough and professional. The ice walls were holding perfectly, no signs of structural weakness. The blocks fused together by their own cold and the snow mortar Thomas had used. "How much firewood you burning?" Henrik asked, pausing near the west wall to run his hand along the ice. "About half what I used to," Thomas replied. "Maybe less. Haven't done exact measurements, but noticeably less." Henrik frowned, his weathered face creasing deeper. "That doesn't make sense. Ice shouldn't insulate. It's frozen water. It's cold. How can cold insulate against cold?" Thomas leaned the axe against a stump. "It's not the ice itself," he explained, as he had explained in his mind 100 times, preparing for this conversation. "It's the air gap. The ice blocks the wind completely. Wind can't penetrate 2 feet of solid ice. and the air between the ice and the cabin can't move, can't circulate, can't carry heat away. So the cabin stays warmer with less fire because the heat isn't being stolen by wind. Henrik considered this, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking it through. "Your grandfather teach you this?" Thomas nodded. From his journals, he traveled north, saw how the indigenous people built their winter shelters. This is a smaller version of what they do. They've been doing it for thousands of years. I just read his notes and tried to replicate it. Henrik grunted, a sound that might have been grudging respect or might have been continued skepticism. "Well," he said finally, "I still think you're mad, but I'll grant you it's clever madness. And if it's working like you say, then maybe there's something to it." He left without another word, but Thomas noticed that Henrik didn't laugh this time, didn't mock, didn't call him a fool. It was a small victory, but Thomas took it. December deepened into the coldest stretch anyone could remember. Temperatures fell to 30 below, then 40 below. The wind screamed across the valley like a living thing, ripping shingles off roofs and snapping trees with sounds like rifle shots. Thomas's cabin sat in its ice fortress, sheltered and quiet. He could hear the wind howling outside the ice walls, a distant roar like an approaching avalanche. But inside the gap, the air barely stirred. He kept his fires small and steady. He had enough firewood to last through February, maybe into March. His neighbors, he knew from occasional visits to Henrik's place, were burning through their supplies at twice the rate, trying desperately to keep their cabins warm against the relentless assault of winter. Henrik stopped by again on Christmas Eve. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the gap between the walls, hands in his pockets, looking up at the ice. The walls seemed to glow in the winter twilight, blue and ethereal and strange. "It's holding," Henrik said finally, his voice quiet. Thomas was inside preparing a modest Christmas dinner, but he heard Henrik's voice through the window and came out. Ash bounded out ahead of him, tail wagging at the visitor, always pleased to see friendly faces. "Yes," Thomas said, "it's holding well." Henrik's face was red from the cold, his eyes watering from the brutal wind he had walked through to get here. "My cabin is freezing," he said bluntly, no pride left to prevent the admission. "I'm burning 4 logs an hour just to keep the frost off the inside walls. My wife is sleeping in 2 coats and still wakes up shivering. I don't know how we're going to make it through January if this cold keeps up." He paused, and the next words seemed to cost him something, seemed to require physical effort to produce. "How are you staying warm in here?" Thomas met his eyes steadily, seeing the desperation there, the fear for his wife's safety. "The ice walls block the wind completely," he explained. "The air gap holds the heat. I'm burning maybe 2 logs every 3 hours, sometimes less, and it's comfortable enough that I'm sleeping without extra blankets." Henrik looked at the cabin, then at the ice walls, then back at Thomas. His expression was complex, mixing shame and hope and desperate need. "Could I build another one?" he asked. "Is there time? Is the lake still safe?" Thomas shook his head. "Not enough time," he said gently. "Not for one person working alone, and the lake ice is too dangerous now with this much cold and snow. Too risky to cut safely." Henrik's face fell. He seemed to age 10 years in that moment, the weight of responsibility for his wife's survival crushing him. Thomas took a breath, making a decision his grandfather would have approved of. "Would you like to bring Martha here?" he asked. "There's enough room. She can have the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. And Ash doesn't mind sharing space." Henrik's face showed relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. He also showed something else. something that might have been shame at having mocked this boy for weeks while he built the very thing that would now save Henrik's wife. "You would do that?" Henrik asked, his voice rough. "After I called you a fool? After I mocked you in front of the whole valley?" Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical," he said. "It was an unusual idea. And I'm not doing this for thanks. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." Henrik reached out and shook Thomas's hand, a firm grip despite the cold, despite the emotion evident on his weathered face. "You're a good man," he said quietly, "like your grandfather. Samuel would be proud of you." By New Year's Day, Thomas's cabin was sheltering 5 people. Henrik's wife Martha, old Joseph, who lived alone and whose cabin had developed gaps in the walls that let wind howl through. Carl's 2 young children, whose mother had died the previous spring, and whose father was desperately trying to keep their poorly insulated house warm enough for their survival. They crowded into the small space, bringing what food they could contribute, and marveled at how comfortable the cabin stayed with just a moderate fire. "The ice walls don't melt," Joseph said on the second night, examining them by lantern light, his old eyes squinting at the construction. "Even with all of us in here generating heat, even with the fire going steady." "Why don't they melt?" Thomas explained again about the gap, about how the ice stayed cold because the outside air was well below freezing, about how the air in the gap couldn't circulate enough to carry heat from the cabin to the ice in sufficient quantity to cause melting. Joseph listened carefully, nodded slowly, and said, "Your grandfather was a smart man, and you were smart enough to listen to him." The storm came on January 6th, and it was unlike anything the valley had seen in a generation. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to inches. Opening the cabin door meant confronting a wall of white nothing, disorienting and terrifying. Wind gusts reached 70 miles per hour, a screaming force that sounded like demons. The temperature plunged to 50 below zero, cold enough to freeze flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill anyone caught outside in less than an hour. Thomas's cabin, in its ice fortress, barely shuddered. Outside, they could hear trees snapping like gunshots, the sharp cracks followed by crashes as they fell. They could hear the wind screaming, a constant roar that seemed to shake the very air. But inside the gap between ice and wood, protected by the double walls and the still air trapped between them, the wind was absent. The cabin stayed quiet, warm, safe. Thomas kept the fire going steadily, burning one log at a time, maintaining a careful rhythm. The 5 people huddled inside, initially tense with fear, gradually relaxed as they realized they were protected. The children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, played with Ash by the fire, the dog patient with their attention, seeming to understand they needed comfort. On the 3rd day of the storm, they heard pounding on the ice wall near the entrance. Thomas pushed through the snow that had drifted into the gap and found 3 more neighbors, nearly frozen, faces blue with cold, begging for shelter. "We couldn't stay in our houses." One of them gasped, a woman named Sarah whose husband had died 2 years ago. The wind tore the door off. Everything inside is freezing solid. We tried to make it to Henrik's place, but we couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then we remembered your ice fortress. Thomas pulled them in without hesitation, got them by the fire, wrapped them in blankets. They huddled together. 8 people now in a cabin built for 1, but alive and warming up. Ash moved among them, offering the comfort of his presence, letting cold hands warm in his fur. That night, by the light of the fire, Henrik spoke what everyone was thinking. "This ice fortress saved our lives," he said, his voice carrying clear in the small space. Without it, some of us would be frozen corpses by now. All of us, probably. Thomas shook his head, uncomfortable with being seen as a savior. "My grandfather saved your lives," he said. "I just read his journals and built what he described." Martha reached out and squeezed Thomas's hand. Her fingers were warm now, recovered from the cold that had nearly killed her weeks ago. "You did more than that," she said gently. "You had the courage to try something everyone called foolish. You worked alone for weeks while we mocked you. That takes a different kind of strength than just reading and building." The storm lasted 5 days total. When it finally broke, the valley was transformed, buried under 8 feet of snow in places, trees down everywhere. Several cabins collapsed entirely under the weight of snow and ice. The boys' cabin stood undamaged, its ice walls slightly taller now from the snow that had drifted and frozen against them, making the fortress even stronger. The 8 people who had sheltered there emerged into the pale sunlight like survivors of a siege. They helped each other dig out paths, check on other neighbors, assess the damage. 3 cabins were total losses. Roofs collapsed, walls buckled. 2 more were so badly damaged they wouldn't be habitable until spring repairs could be made. A meeting was called at Henrik's place, the largest structure still standing. 27 people crowded inside, everyone who lived within 5 miles. Thomas sat near the back, Ash at his feet, listening as the adults discussed what to do. "We need to rebuild," Carl said, his voice tight with stress. "But we can't rebuild in this cold. We'll freeze before we finish. And another storm like that one could come any time." "We need shelter now," someone else added. "Warm shelter that can survive what winter throws at us." Henrik stood up slowly. He looked across the room, meeting eyes, until he found Thomas sitting quietly in the back. "I propose," he said clearly, "that we ask young Thomas if he'll teach us his method. We have 1 cabin that stayed warm through the worst storm any of us have seen. We have 8 people who are alive because of that cabin. We should learn from that." Heads turned. Eyes found Thomas. He felt his face flush, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Ash pressed against his leg, sensing his discomfort. Henrik continued, his voice firm. "I mocked this boy. I called his work foolishness. I laughed at him while he built something that ended up saving my wife's life. I was wrong, and I'm man enough to admit it. His ice walls work. They work better than anything we've built with our traditional methods. So I'm asking, Thomas, will you teach us? Will you show us how to build what you built?" Thomas stood slowly. The room went quiet, waiting. He looked at the faces around him, saw fear and hope and desperation. These were his neighbors, his community, people who had known his grandfather, who had helped raise him after his parents died, who had brought food when he was alone. "I'll teach anyone who wants to learn," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "But we'll need to work together. There's not enough time for each person to build their own walls alone. We'll need to cut ice in teams, haul it in teams, build in teams." An older woman named Marta spoke up. "Where will we get the ice? The lake is too dangerous now with all this snow. We can't even see where the ice ends and the shore begins." Thomas had already thought about this during the long days of the storm. "There's a stretch of the river about 2 miles east that flows slow and freezes thick," he said. "The current keeps snow from piling up too deep. The ice there should be safe to cut if we're careful. We can set up a cutting operation, bring the blocks in by sled. If everyone works together, we can build ice walls for the damaged cabins within 2 weeks." Henrik nodded. Decision made. "We start tomorrow at first light. Everyone able-bodied comes to help." The work began the next morning. 20 people went to the river with saws, axes, and sleds. Thomas showed them how to test the ice for thickness, tapping it, listening to the sound, drilling test holes. He showed them how to score lines, how to cut blocks of uniform size, how to split them cleanly without shattering. They worked in shifts, some cutting, some hauling, some building. The first new ice fortress went up around Carl's damaged cabin, reinforcing what remained and creating the crucial air gap that would keep his children warm. It took 3 days with everyone working together, and when it was finished, Carl stood in the gap between ice and wood, tears freezing on his face. "My children will be warm tonight," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you all." They built 4 more ice fortresses over the next 2 weeks: Old Joseph's cabin, Marta's place, the Peterson family house, the widow Anderson's small home. Each one took less time than the last as people learned the technique, understood the principles, worked more efficiently together. Thomas moved from site to site, checking gaps, adjusting placements, explaining why certain things mattered, why the air gap had to be exactly 3 feet, why the blocks needed to be offset like bricks, why snow made better mortar than water. By the end of February, the valley had changed. What had been a collection of isolated wooden cabins struggling against winter was now a cluster of ice fortresses shimmering blue-white in the winter sun. People burned half the firewood they used to. Homes stayed comfortable through the coldest nights. Children slept warm instead of waking shivering. And when another storm rolled through in mid-February, everyone sheltered safely in their reinforced cabins, the ice walls standing firm against wind that would have frozen them in their beds a few months earlier. Spring came late that year. The ice walls stood until mid-April, when the temperature finally rose enough to begin melting them. Thomas watched his fortress drip and diminish, the blocks separating, collapsing, turning into water that soaked into the ground and fed the spring grass. By May, all the ice was gone, leaving just the wooden cabins standing alone again. But something had changed in the valley beyond just the buildings. Henrik organized a gathering to thank Thomas formally. Everyone came, bringing food, small gifts, words of gratitude. Henrik stood and made a short speech about courage and innovation, about listening to new ideas even when they seemed strange, about admitting when you were wrong. Thomas accepted their thanks quietly, deflecting credit to his grandfather's journals, uncomfortable with praise. But that night, alone in his cabin with just Ash for company, he allowed himself to feel proud. He had saved lives, not through strength or violence or dramatic heroism, but through careful reading, patient planning, and hard work. His grandfather's knowledge, combined with his own determination, had made the difference between survival and death for families he had known his whole life. Ash rested his head on Thomas's knee, and Thomas scratched behind the familiar ears. "We did good, boy," he said quietly. Grandfather would be proud. Ash's tail thumped against the floor, and in the dog's brown eyes, Thomas saw agreement. The next winter, Thomas didn't have to work alone. In October, people came to him asking to learn the ice wall technique again, wanting to rebuild their fortresses before the cold arrived. He taught them patiently, showing young people who were learning for the first time, helping adults who had built once but wanted to improve. By mid-November, 8 cabins had their ice fortresses rebuilt, improved with lessons learned from the previous year. Thicker walls on the west side, better drainage for meltwater, stronger foundations. The winters that followed were never quite as brutal as that first one, but the ice walls became tradition in the valley. Every autumn, as the lakes froze, people would cut blocks and build their fortresses, working together, sharing knowledge, helping neighbors. Children grew up learning to construct ice walls the way their parents had learned to stack firewood or thatch roofs. And they called them Thomas's walls, even after he was grown, even after he married Henrik's daughter and built his own larger cabin, even after his own children learned to cut ice blocks by the river. The technique spread to other valleys, other communities facing harsh winters. Travelers would stop and stare at the ice fortresses, asking how they worked, learning the principles of air gaps and wind breaks and thermal barriers. Some adopted the method. Others dismissed it as too much work, too strange, too different from what they knew. But those who built the ice walls survived winters that killed people in traditional cabins. And gradually, over years, the technique became common knowledge in the mountain valleys, a standard practice for anyone who wanted to survive deep cold. Years later, when Thomas was an old man himself, his hair gray and his hands gnarled with age, a young visitor came to the valley studying traditional survival methods. She was from a university back east, documenting indigenous and frontier knowledge before it was lost. She interviewed Thomas, asked him about the ice walls, wanted to know how he had thought of the idea. "I didn't think of it," Thomas told her honestly, sitting in the cabin he had built with his sons. Ash long gone, but other dogs now filling that role. "My grandfather learned it from people who had lived in cold places for thousands of years. Indigenous people who understood winter in ways we settlers never did. I just read his journals and tried what he described. But you were the one who built it," she insisted, her pen moving across paper. "You did the work when everyone said you were crazy." "That took courage," Thomas smiled, remembering Henrik's voice calling him a fool, remembering the weight of those first ice blocks, remembering Ash's uncertain tail wag those first days. "I suppose I was crazy," he said. "But sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that keep you alive. And sometimes the old knowledge, the knowledge people dismiss as primitive or outdated, turns out to be the most valuable knowledge of all." The ice walls still went up every winter in the valley, maintained by his grandchildren now, taught to newcomers, adapted and improved with each generation. And on the coldest nights, people would sit by their fires, warm and safe behind their double walls of wood and ice, and tell stories about Thomas who built the first fortress while his neighbors laughed, the boy and his dog who saved lives with frozen water and stubborn determination, and a dead grandfather's journals. Ash was remembered in those stories too. Always the loyal companion who sat through weeks of construction, who trusted his human's strange vision, who had been there at the beginning when one 17-year-old boy stood alone against winter and won.